Welcome back, artists. I'm Wyatt Paints, and today I've got a nostalgic video for you. Kang and Kodos from The Simpsons has landed on my painted desk looking to cook up some humans this episode. I also tackle getting crystal clear resin for their domes. Now I don't want to waste any more time talking. I'm going to go grab my brushes so I can bring these two iconic Simpsons characters to life. Let's get started. For these aliens, we're going to start my spray booth. I based them both in camo green and started the first highlight with a scorpion green. Using an airbrush here will allow me to lay down super smooth thin layers and create a buttery smooth transition in minutes compared to the hours it would take to get these results with a brush. But to be perfectly honest, I don't think I've ever gotten a transition with a plain brush like I can with an airbrush. While I and many others will tell you that you can pull this off with a brush, I think there's maybe a handful of people that can legitimately do it, and I'm not one of them. So I use a better tool for the results I want. As a final highlight before I leave the booth, I used light livery green. I shot this from a high angle so it focused on the top of his head and his tentacles. This also put a nice soft transition on his face as well. For these alien invaders, my client wanted a more natural shading like this, as opposed to a flat cartoon look. By now, you may have noticed that these two actually have different designs. While this doesn't make them identical like they are in a show, so long as we paint them similarly, they should fit together without a problem. But for now, it's time to wrap this up and move over to the painting table to brush in the details. The first detail is to black out their mouths. This was easier said than done, as those teeth always seem to be in the worst possible place. While troublesome, I did finish this off fairly quickly, though I did find myself going back to touch it up often, because a pure black mouth is a key part of that Simpsons art style. This way, while I am divergent from the simplistic color palette, it'll still look right as a Simpsons character. Now, one of these aliens has a tongue, so I grabbed some very blurry glory red to paint in that tongue. I kept this pretty simple, as again, the teeth were always in the way, and would make doing much more than using the undercoats of green and black to give me some simple shadows pretty difficult. I'm pretty sure leaving it simple here was the best choice. Now thankfully, they both have their iconic drool. I think Void Shield Blue is a great color for this. A quick couple of coats look fantastic, and I almost wanted to leave it. But it could use a little bit of something, so I grabbed some Frostbite to mix in to get a subtle highlight. Keeping this on the gathered drops and where it spills over the contours of the lips, I wanted it to be there but not be too bold, so I thinned this down closer to a glaze. After a couple of passes, I moved on to the final detail in the mouth, the teeth. Skeletal Bone stepped in to base coat these. I found myself torn between this and Menoth White for bones and teeth. Honestly, they're so close that they're interchangeable, so these days it comes down to which one is closer. They both give a solid creamy beige to work from, but for today, Skeletal Bone was the winner. I used Argas Earthshade to add shadows to the teeth. This is a departure from my usual use of sepia, but I wanted to try it out to see how I like it. While I do like the final look of the teeth, I did find this shade to be a bit too dark for this application. Progressive layers of thinned down skeletal bone got the tone back to something that looks good, but to be fair, this took more layers than I wanted it to. I think I'll stick to my go-to sepia shade for these kind of uses, but it's good to experiment from time to time, so long as you're willing to put in the work to make them work, or redo it if it doesn't. But real quick, I'd like to take this moment to thank my subscribers over at Patreon. Your continued support keeps the sexy nude stocked so I can keep on painting. Thank you. If you'd like to check out the Painting Pantheon for yourself, there'll be a link in the description down below. There you'll also find my Amazon affiliate link. If you're going to be going shopping anyways, using this portal will allow you to support the channel through the small commission that we'll make. And finally, if you haven't already, be sure to like and subscribe. Doing so is the #1 way you can help put this video in front of more eyes just like yours. Any way you've decided to help my small channel is greatly appreciated. And if I didn't earn your subscription on this video, maybe check out some of my other ones and hopefully I'll change your mind. But for now, let's get back to Kodos and Kang. Now, being Cyclopses, Cyclopsi? One second. Let's see. Cyclopes? Nah, Webster's messing with me now. Why are you trying to make me sound stupid, Google? Man, I don't know. What I do know is that they each have one eye and there's two of them. Either way, these eyes needed to be a desaturated pale yellow. Mixing white and dark flesh got me the shade I was looking for. Putting yellows over green can be taxing, as yellow tends to cover poorly, but the addition of white helps the coverage issue. Even still, it would take me about 4 or 5 coats to get it fully opaque. Anytime I mix a custom color for my project, I'm sure to employ my wet palette as a way to keep this color indefinitely if I ever need to do a touch-up, which I will. I followed this up with painting the pupils in with black. Nothing really to say here, I just painted within the lines, and once it was all black, I moved on. And since my black was already out, it was a good time to black out the collars to set up for the metallics I planned later. And with the magic of editing, that later is now, with gunmetal. I wanted to keep the collars simple, as not only was there not a lot of details to paint, but the Simpsons in general are very simply drawn. So a simple base with metallic and some flat colors for the details were my first thought. With that in mind, I used Andrea blue and scarlet red to tag out the small details. Now, I know you can see yellow in some of those details, just ignore those. The yellow was a first early choice, but with the yellow in his eye, it felt a little samey, and it actually ended up being a little too bright and drew attention away from the face. So the red filled in its place just fine. One of the last details to paint was the spots that appear on the top of their heads. Uniform green filled this role like a charm. I kept these fairly random by changing the angle I held the model. I find it's easier to do this than trying to consciously be random, because no matter how hard I try, a pattern would tend to develop. But when I change the angle I'm holding it, it becomes pretty impossible to accidentally repeat myself. After a dozen or so large spots, I snuck in a few smaller ones to fill in the bare areas. And then I called the spots done. But before I can call them actually done, something was just nagging at me. These two being cartoon characters but having no black outlines just didn't seem right. So I grabbed some Nuln oil to fix it and added a pin wash around each eye. This is where saving that pale yellow I mixed earlier really paid off, because I was able to clean up any extra wash that stained the eye where I didn't want it. The final touch-up needed to finish off these two were a couple of clear domes. This was actually going to be some new ground for me, because I've never used clear resin before. The first print left much to be desired, but it piqued my interest and curiosity on how to improve. So I headed on over to Reddit to tap into the knowledge base there. Then I pooled all the tips I got into one process to give me success. My first change came with setting up the file and ensuring I did not put supports where I didn't need them. And I increased my normal exposure to 3.9 seconds, which surprised me as a bit counterintuitive. But it worked, so I'm not going to fight it. Once it came off the printer and I had the supports removed, I didn't clean it at all and cured it immediately for 3 minutes using my handheld UV light. This allows the excess resin on the surface to fill in the thousands of layer edges nice and smooth. And being strict with my curing time helps prevent clear resin from yellowing. Once done curing, there was a film left on the surface which I felt for safety needed to go. But once clean, an opaque fog spread over the dome. But this was to be expected. The next step is going to take sanding both the inside and the outside of the dome. I worked my way through several grits of sandpaper, starting with 400 to 600, 1,000, 2,000, 3,000, and finally 5,000. If you think this process would take forever and be tedious, you'd only be half right, because it actually took me less than 20 minutes per dome. At this point, the surface was about as smooth as I'd be able to get it by hand, so it was time for a quick cleaning and drying, after which, this is what it looked like. But this wasn't its final form, as it was time for the final clear resin tip, Gloss Clear Varnish. For this, I used Krylon. A few light coats inside and out revealed a wonderfully transparent dome. Sliding it onto Kodos let me see the fruits of my labor. And with that, these two increasingly hungry aliens were done. Since I was asked to add some printing stats, here they go. These each took just under 17 hours to print and about 200 milliliters of resin when hollowed out, while the domes took about 8 hours to print and 100 milliliters each. And while the main bodies were printed on an Elgo Jupiter using rich opto resin, the domes were printed on an Elgo Saturn using Anycubic water washable clear resin. I hope you enjoyed this video. This one took a little bit longer than my typical videos, but I wanted to try to be as thorough with everything, especially the tips for the dome. If you're interested in doing this model for yourself, I have a link to some of the models in the description below. Unfortunately, I don't have a link to both of them, but if I find the other one, I'll add it later. If there's anything you'd like to see added to these videos, please let me know in the comments. I'm always interested in what you'd like to see. And as always, thank you for watching, stay creative, and always enjoy the process. Cyclopes? Cyclopes. That can't be right, Webster. You're lying.